This is CozyHaven, one of Minecraft's most coziest mod packs. For the next 100 days, I plan to transform the area with lots of beautiful builds and survive off the land. Day 1, I spawned in, taking a moment to enjoy the view I had before me. It looks like we spawned in the plains biome with a forest nearby. I chopped down these small trees and made our very first tools. After that, I killed some sheep to make a bed and stumbled upon a cave. With my pickaxe, I dug up some stone and crafted a furnace to cook our mutton. It was here that I collected coal and discovered that you could make copper tools. Following that, we made a small camp at the edge of the forest and did some crafting. Then I collected some wood and ventured down a cave entrance which led to a huge cavern. This cave was littered with all sorts of ores, but I was finding it difficult to acquire iron. Day 2 rolled around and I made a fresh set of copper tools. Our goal was to build a house to live in, so I went around chopping down trees. This is when I found out that you could chop trees faster by crouching. This saved so much time as I went around gathering oak and birchwood, and I also did some exploring and came upon a sandy beach with a redwood forest across the river that separated us. Day 3, I went around chopping more trees. This time I cut down some jungle wood, feeding myself the apples that we collected along the way. After that, I went down into the mines again, and this time I searched for andesite and granite. During this expedition, I collected a lot of copper, but couldn't find any of the blocks that I was looking for. Unsuccessful, I returned back to the surface. The following day, I explored the surface, uncovering some new caves nearby filled with lots of coal and other ores, but no andesite or granite. It was then that I just decided to dig up a bunch of cobblestone. We were going to need smooth stone anyway, so I thought I should just acquire the easier blocks first. Day 5, I woke up to a dangerous intruder. After dodging its arrows and taking some damage, I managed to slay the skeleton and went around collecting pork chops as we were running low on food. Then I went back to digging up more cobblestone underground. Eventually, I made a long tunnel to make it easier for us to reach the cavern, then wandered around until I found an area with andesite and tuff. It also had these prismarine-looking blocks, which might come in handy later. Then, as day 6 rolled around, I was exploring the caves and gathering iron when I discovered a camp filled with goodies. I gathered the loot and returned to the surface to empty out my inventory and smelt our iron. Low on food, I went around gathering some steak to cook and then made a boat to sail around in search of clay. Our house needed bricks, so I dove underneath the water and dug up a few stacks of clay, using a wooden door to allow us to breathe. We then returned back to camp and made a bunch of furnaces to smelt our bricks. On this day, I got a head start on building the foundation to our home, using a variety of tough cobblestone and andesite to give it some texture. Once that was finished, I went back to our camp and crafted the very first set of iron armor. Day 9, I went back underground in search of granite and ores. It was here that I found some more camps with even better loot. I even acquired a lucky hat. We then got our very first diamond tools and some blocks that we could use. After all that mining and looting, our inventory was getting full, so we returned to the surface. At this point, I just felt like it was pointless to search for granite, so I decided to go down into the depths again and dig up some deep slate. The deep slate was needed for the house we were going to build, so I acquired about 8 stacks of it. I got started by creating a wooden saw. It's basically like a stone cutter, but for wood blocks, and it saved us a lot of resources. Then I got to work on creating the porch for our house using deep slate slabs and stairs for the outline. After that, day 12 rolled around and I got to work on the pillars of our house using jungle and oak wood. As I was about to finish, a wandering wine trader stopped by. They had some good stuff to sell, but we had no emeralds to spare. I then got curious about his donkeys, and as I checked their inventory, my game crashed. When I restarted my game, we started over again on day 11, so I had to go through the whole process of building everything, and to make sure it wouldn't crash a second time, I ignored every trader. Day 13, with the variety of wood that I have been collecting, I made the walls of our building. I wanted to go for a textured, gradient kind of look to it, starting from jungle wood and ending with birch. Then, following this, I went back down into the depths to mine some of those blue-looking blocks called viridium for the roof of our house. Once we had about 8 stacks, we returned to the surface and experimented with the porch roof. On day 15, I installed the rest of our Viridium roof, which created this amazing blue color that popped out. Then I made some overhangs for the windows on top of our roof for some extra lighting and details. Now that most of the exterior was completed, it was now time to work on the interior. I started by adding in a unique oak flooring to the first floor. Then I got a little carried away and tried to change up the walls, but realized it already looked good the way it was. Lastly, I made some oak stairs to be used to create the ceiling of our house. The following day, I installed our ceiling and a stairway leading up to the second floor. This is when I put in jungle logs into our saw and found the floorboard block. This block added a nice contrast to our house, so I used it for our second floor. I liked it so much that I took out the first floor planks and replaced them with our new floorboard blocks. After that, we added the ceiling to the second floor and then shutters to our outside windows. On day 18, I crafted some buttons and placed them outside of our walls to add some detail. By now, it was time to put in our chimney, so I made a bunch of bricks and started building it up at the side of our house. Using a variety of bricks and brick walls, I was able to create this simple-looking chimney that will direct the smoke outside of our house. The first thing I did on this day was make a bunch of these trellises because I thought they would make good windows. I found out that they don't look that good and instead used birch tables to place as window frames. This looked much better in my opinion, and I abandoned the trellises at the side of our house. Next, we made some fancy-looking trapdoors and a door with the carpenter's workbench, and following that, it was time to create a storage area for us to use. Once the storage area was complete, I started moving all of our junk to their designated chests. Day 20 started with me moving the last bits of junk into our chests, and then I made some campfires to place into our fireplace. After that, I crafted some fancy oil lamps and continued to move our resources to our official base. I then ended the day by going around looking for crops as it was time for us to start farming. We were running out of food and needed farm animals to harvest their meat. As I made my way to the beach, I found carrots and cabbages, but did not expect to find coconuts. These must have fallen from the tree, and I was excited to see what I could make with it. On day 21, the first thing that I did was make golden carrots. This should provide us enough sustenance for a while, and after that I worked on interior decorating, adding shelves and tables, along with chairs and a ladder to the attic. Then, towards the end of the day, I thought of making a saddle and taming a horse. This would make it much easier for us to travel and look for vegetables. My primary goal for this day was to find a horse to tame. I did find a variety of crops like onions and grapes. Off in the distance, I spotted a pillager outpost, and after raiding them, I looted the chests filled with valuables. I continued to look for a horse and gathered crops along the way. We even found a large pot which we brought home with us and discovered these silk cocoons that give us loot when broken. However, I didn't find any horses that day, so we just had to walk by foot. To make our house stand out more, I put a campfire and hay bale into our chimney. The smoke would make it easier to spot from a distance. Following this, I continued my search for a horse, but came upon a strange creature called the Mauler. He seems pretty cool, so I left him alone and continued on my adventure. As I got farther, I spotted a strange structure, which turned out to be an abandoned ruin. There was even a stand with some chests nearby, giving us promising loot. This was when I finally found horses and tamed my first one. However, it seems like all the horses have the same speed. But whatever it was, by now the sun was setting, so we returned home with our new friend. Day 24, I started work on a temporary farm. We needed enough seeds to create the large farmland we wanted, so I made some buckets and had an infinite water source. After that, we tilled the soil and planted all the crops that we found on our adventure. It doesn't look too interesting right now, but our area will look much better in the future. The following day, I woke up and went down into the mines to dig up cobblestone. While our crops were growing, I wanted to create garden beds at the side of our house using cobblestone as an outline. I built the first garden bed and tilled the soil, hiding the water underneath the walls. The next day, I finished up the first garden and planted strawberries in this field. After that, I got to work on the next one, gathering the seeds that I had available to plant in our second garden bed. Most of the day was spent building the walls and hiding the water source. Once that was done, we planted lettuce seeds in this little garden of ours. By now, most of our crops had matured, so I harvested the ones that I could and left some to continue growing. I planted some strawberries and lettuces in our new gardens and got to work on the last 2 plots on this side. Day 28, we turned this garden into a cabbage patch and finished tilling the soil in the next one over. This one would be filled with red tomatoes. After that, I decided to just harvest the rest of the crops we had growing in our temporary garden, as it was now time to repeat the same process on the other end. The next day, after plugging up the water sources, I got to work immediately on constructing the next garden beds. By now, I was starting to get the hang of the shape I wanted, and it made it easier to build these gardens. It started to rain halfway through as I began construction on the third one. On day 30, I got rid of all the tilled soil outside of our garden and then planted our very first wheat farm. After that, I repeated the same process as I usually do with the other 2 gardens. All of our plots were finally finished and we started to plant carrots, onions, and peanuts in each and every empty garden. After that, a large amount of our strawberries were ready to be harvested, so we picked them and replanted as many crops as we could to fill up each garden plot. Towards the end of the day, I started to experiment with the grapevine stems to see how they worked. Day 32 to 33, I went out to chop down trees in the nearby forest. These logs would then be turned into grapevine stems via the saw, and I would carefully place each stem in front of our house in rows. We had to make sure that they had enough space in between to create a beautiful vineyard. Once our vineyard was complete, I started adding paths down from our house and paths between each garden plot that we made. Then after that, I went down into the mines to gather gravel so we could make coarse dirt. Day 35, using the coarse dirt I made, I filled in each grapevine row to make it look more worn down and used. By now, our cozy little settlement was looking much better and we could start brewing some delicious wine. But before we start making wine, we needed food. And to get food, we needed to set up proper animal pens. Since we were out of golden carrots, the next best thing to eat were strawberries. After that, I went down into the mines to collect a couple stacks of cobblestone to smelt into smooth stone. On these 2 days, I ventured further into the mines, getting distracted and collecting a bunch of iron. It was here that I discovered the granite that we were looking for. For so long, it was just sitting here at the side of the caverns. So after I dug up the iron, I started to collect all the granite I could, so we didn't have to come back down here again. Originally, I was planning to use the granite to make our roof of our house, but it could be used for other projects. Day 39, I made a bunch of new furnaces and started smelting all the ores that we collected. While they were cooking, I went outside to harvest and replant our crops. I even thought about making peanut butter sandwiches, but realized that we didn't have all the ingredients needed. Day 40, I spent my time digging up tough and deep slate blocks for our animal pens and future projects. Not much happened on this day, other than resource gathering. From day 41 to 43, I got started on building our animal pens. At first, I wasn't sure where to put them. I thought about laying them down at the sides of our houses, but felt it would look better if it was built further down. The first pens were in circular shapes. I didn't like them, so I changed them to look rectangular. We built up the walls to prevent the animals from escaping and added little archways to enter into the pens. On day 44, I finished up the last animal pen and started to harvest some of the crops that were done growing. Since we were running out of strawberries to eat, I decided to take some of the peanuts, cabbages, and tomatoes and make ourselves a peanut salad. This should last us for a while until we could afford to eat meat. After that, I added proper gates to our pens and went out to kidnap unsuspecting animals, placing them inside of their new homes. I started my day by feeding our animals and then dug up this little dirt mound. I also extended the path slightly, but left it there as I planned to build something at the center of all the animal pens. Once that was done, I looked through a bunch of crafting recipes to see what we could build and detail around our house. Day 46 to 47, I began construction on our next project. This was going to be where we could brew our wine, and using a variety of stone blocks, I was going for this warehouse-looking building. I wanted to make sure it was tall enough and had the adequate space to house our barrels and silos. To make sure that we would eventually have enough meat, I fed our farm animals their breakfast and got back to work on the winery warehouse. Today's goal was to install a roof to this warehouse. First, I worked on the roof of the entrance, using the deep slate as a border and granite as the main color. After that, I finished up the outline of the main roof, leaving the rest to complete tomorrow. On this day, I filled up the rest of the main roof with granite slabs and then added these little support columns at the sides of our building to make it look more sturdy. The building does look a bit flat, but I think all warehouses are pretty flat in general. Following this, I finished by adding arches to the entrance of our building. We are finally halfway through, and if you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe, as that would really help the channel. Anyways, we began our day by harvesting our crops and feeding our farm animals. After that, I made some golden carrots again to eat, and then it was back to work on the warehouse. Today, our objective was to start the interior of the winery. First, I began by clearing out the dirt and adding in floorboards. Next, I crafted some large wine barrels and placed them all on the first floor, as well as some silos. To be honest, I don't know how to work these things yet, but that's something that we'll figure out later. I finished today by adding a second layer to put in more wine barrels that we could use. I continued working on the warehouse, adding in more layers to our brewing area, and finally adding in windows. After that, I added more barrels and some oil lamps to give the place some light and prevent mobs from ruining our delicious drinks. Day 52, I set off to chop more trees. These logs would then be turned into grapevine pots that we decorated the interior with. Then, the rest of the wood were fashioned into windows, preventing any birds from getting inside. After that, I went around to feed our farm animals. By now, their population was steadily growing, but not enough yet to harvest. Lastly, I spent some time experimenting and detailing the outside of our warehouse. The next day, I finally installed a large doorway to our building and made a path leading up to it. I also juiced some grapes by jumping on top of them in the pots and then tried to figure out how to brew wine. You see, it was at this point that I realized I made a big mistake. It turns out that most of the blocks that we had in the warehouse, the barrels and silo, were used to brew beer, not wine. I wasn't sure of what to do at this point, so I thought about taking out all the barrels and silos, but no, I had an even better idea. I would just keep this warehouse strictly for beer and instead create a brand new warehouse to let our wine age. So I set off to build a foundation for our actual winery and gathered some more cobblestone. On this day, I began construction on the roof of our winery. It was going to be made out of stone like our brewery, and I experimented with a variety of roof shapes until I just decided on this simple slab one. Day 56, I put in our granite roof and fed all of our farm animals. Then, with my pickaxe, I left to the mines to dig up more cobblestone and returned home to smelt them in my furnace. I planned to add more to our winery, so we would be needing more stone. I started work on a new section of this building. This part was going to be a tower, which will add more depth and shape to our building. Once we built it up high enough, I added some details to our tower using walls and deep slate to outline the roof. However, by the time we started working on the roof, the sun was already setting. The following day, I completed the roof of the tower, making it as pointy as possible. After that, I went back to feeding our farm animals. Soon, we will be able to eat meat instead of carrots all day. Lastly, I put in the floorboards and installed these fancy windows to our winery. To make the building look more sturdy, I added these support columns again, and then some buttons to the outside of the build. Using the jungle wood, I finally placed a door at the entrance and then made the fermentation barrels and wine shelves. With the blocks in our hand, we started decorating the interior of our winery, adding tables, chairs, and these apple presses. To connect our buildings together, I paved a path to our new winery. Following that, I moved out the oak trellises and placed them in different locations around our house. We were running out of crops to feed our animals, but luckily, most of them were done growing, so we harvested them and then gave our animals their very first meal of the day. I ended the day by fixing up the borders of our paths, breaking dirt blocks and replacing them with stone. This extra attention to detail continued on to the next day as I did this with all the gardens and areas that had exposed dirt underneath them. Then I ended the day by picking all the purple grapes that had grown. Day 63, I went off to the beach to gather some sand. These blocks would be smelted into glass, which was important as we needed to make wine bottles. Back in a winery, I filled up the tubs with grapes and mushed them up together by jumping. Once they turned into a watery liquid, I stored them into our new wine bottles. The next day, we started by picking the white grapes and began winemaking again. You couldn't put these bottles in the shelves because they don't technically count as wine, they're just juice. So to make an easy wine, which was red wine, we would need sugar. So I set off on my horse to see if there were any sugarcane nearby. This is when I remembered that I found some a while back, so I set up a temporary sugarcane farm behind the house. Then I combined the red grape juices with sugar to create our very first bottle of red wine. Day 65, we got on our horse and went to do some exploring. I wanted to see if I could find more sugarcane to plant when I stumbled upon a lone villager camping next to a river. It was an archaeologist who didn't really offer anything interesting, so we left them alone. After that, I arrived at a group of horses, and after taming one, it turned out to be way faster than our first horse. So, with this new horse, I set off back home, arriving much sooner than expected. It was on this day that I finally decided to lower the number of farm animals that we had. This produced us a large amount of meat for recipes, and so I went to gather some logs which I turned into cabinets. After that, I made some cookware which we will be using to make delicious meals in our new kitchen. Day 67, I finished decorating our kitchen with a long table and moved our produce downstairs. I then went out to the garden to gather vegetables, and with the red wine that we made, I brought them to our kitchen to make a new dish, lettuce with steak. Eating this dish gives us a slow falling effect, as the red wine has that ability. Following this, I looked at more recipes and dishes that I could make with the vegetables and meat that we already had. This is when I decided to cook up some pasta, which needed wheat. Then afterwards, I collected a bunch of tomatoes to make tomato soup. While the tomatoes were cooking, I went out to harvest more of our crops, and after that, I made more bowls. Combining the pasta noodles, tomato sauce, and mutton, we made ourselves pasta with mutton chop. Towards the end of the day, most of our sugarcane had finished growing, so we replanted some more and used the rest to make more red wine. Day 69, I started my day by making more wine, except this time with the white grapes that we had. After that, I harvested our wheat and went around feeding our farm animals to repopulate them. By now, I had some more projects planned and buildings to construct, so I decided to take our dirt and do some terraforming around our house. The following day, I finished up some last-minute terraforming details and then crafted our very first backpack. I upgraded this backpack to an iron version and then set off into the mines to dig up some cobblestone. We were going to need a lot for the next building I wanted to create, so I didn't return home until I had about 10 stacks of cobble. 5 of them were tossed into the furnace to smelt. Day 71, early into the morning, I went around gathering oak wood for more building blocks. Not much happened on this day as I traveled back down into the caves to dig up tuff as we were running low. On day 72, I decided to start slowly expanding our sugarcane farm, placing it next to our cow pen. First, we started by doing some minor terraforming, then I gathered as much sugarcane as I could and started to plant them down. After that was finished, I decided that it would be a good idea to start farming bees, so I crafted some campfires to use the next morning. The following day, we rode on our horse and traveled to nearby beehives to harvest some wax. After that, we returned home and made beehives, placing them at the center of our animal pens. This central location would also be a place where we could start planting flowers to add more color to our base. Then, with a tulip in my hand, I went around trying to recruit more bees to their new homes. I only ended up with one though. Day 74, I woke up an angry bee by breaking into their home. After they calmed down, I tried to lure them back, but for some reason, they died halfway. I don't know how that happened, but that didn't stop me from gathering more bees. Before long, we had 6 bees in totals, and to make them happy, I planted a bunch of poppies, bone mealing them to make these large bundles. This is when I felt that the area would look so much better with coarse dirt, so I went to gather gravel. The next day, I detailed the bee farm with coarse dirt and replanted our poppies. One of our hives was ready to be harvested, but I forgot that they needed campfire underneath, so after the bees calmed down, I planted some campfires underneath each beehive. My problem here was that now the bees were returning to their homes and instead were lost around our base. I had to bring back 2 of them, but I was still missing a few of the other bees. While we were working on our bee farm, our sugarcane had grown, so I harvested more and started to expand the farm. Once that was done, I continued to detail the bee farm to make it look better and added new beehives. Early in the morning of day 77, I went off to the beach to gather sand. You see, one of the biggest problems of the bee farm was that the bees kept on escaping and not returning to their hives. I thought about creating some sort of greenhouse so that we could have more, and that's why I needed glass. Despite this, I was torn on the concept of the bee farm. On one hand, the bees weren't returning to their homes, but on the other, it looked way better if the farm was open, which added more color and life to the area. There were a few times where I annoyed the bees, but I worked through it to remodel the area. I even started placing toughened stone blocks for a possible building to encase the farm. The next day, I continued working on the farm, breeding more bees, and scrapping the idea of having a building to house all the bees. Instead, I really thought it would look much better if we just added a tree at its center, so I went to gather leaves at the nearby forest. On day 79 to 80, I got to work building the oak tree that would block the sun and provide shade to the bees. It took all day to complete this custom tree as I climbed to add leaves and foliage, but despite this, I felt like the tree was looking off. So I made a hard decision. I decided to tear down the whole tree and instead created a mound of flowers at the center of the beehives. It was at this point that I was having a builder's block where I wasn't too sure of what to add to make this area look better. Day 81, I extended the path from our house and wrapped it all around our bee farm. I decided that since the bees weren't returning home, I would just keep breeding more of them until there's so much that it's not really that noticeable if a few went missing. By now, we had a sizable number that could keep the farm running. The next day, I went back to work on the sugarcane field, extending it to the other side where the sheep and pigs were. I wished that you could plant sugarcane without water, but unfortunately we couldn't. This continued on to day 83 as I made slabs to cover up the water holes, but then remembered that you can make dirt slabs, so I used those instead. To put the jungle slabs that I made to use, I decided to place them underneath the paths so that way the dirt won't be exposed. Next to our lettuce garden, I connected the main path to our house, something which I forgot to do earlier, and then continued to breed more of our bees. It was here that I began experimenting with wine again and made some white grape wine. There was one particular wine that could give us double jump, but we would need to find the white grapes that grew in the jungle. Luckily, we found some nearby, but it turns out that these don't grow on stems. Instead, they grew on vines, so I had to place some at the side of our house. While those were growing, I thought it would be cool to add a stone gate to the entrance of our base. Using a mixture of cobblestone, I was able to make this archway with a path extended out to welcome our visitors. There was also a wandering trader whose llama got stuck in our chicken coop, so I got a free lead from that. After that, I ended the day by harvesting our wheat and carrots. Day 86, I made it a goal to get working on brewing some beer. So I made myself a sleeping bag, hopped on my horse, and rode off into the distance to look for barley and other crops that I could grow. And right when I set foot outside of my property, it started to rain. I didn't let that stop me from enjoying the journey, and I enjoyed the scenery. Along this adventure, I found a waystone and an abandoned home that had nothing in it but an urn with some minor loot. As we traveled, I discovered a tavern with one lone villager working here. I slept outside of his tavern. The following day, I continued my adventure, taking in the beautiful biomes that we explored and hoping to find new crops. I also came upon a small archaeology camp that had nothing much in it, and I ventured into this beautiful flower field meadow, whatever it was. It looked like a place straight out of a Studio Ghibli film. After some more exploring, I decided to make my way in the direction of home since I didn't find what I wanted. I arrived home on day 88, taking care of the bees and whatnot. Instead of giving up on finding crops, I thought it would be a better idea to travel in my boat. Making my way to the beach, I noticed that we had a furry friend who wanted to tag along, so we took them along with us, and as I sailed along the coast, I spotted these strange-looking bushes. These bushes turned out to be salmon berries, which we took. I got distracted and started exploring on foot when I found what we were looking for: hops. With these seeds, we could make some beer. I continued making my way out of the area and reached a birch forest with a village nearby. Heading straight to a house and into a chest, I got my hands on corn and potatoes. I went around looting the place and slept outside. There was some pretty good loot in this village. Waking up to day 89, I continued to plunder the rest of the village and traveled some more, trudging through this jungle. It was here that I found some new crops: hibiscus and coffee. These could be brewed into different drinks, so I returned back to our boat, with our friend still waiting, and sailed across the river. I decided to release him back to his family and realized that there were some beetroots sitting on this beach. I made my way back home, storing away all of my loot, and made some wine with the jungle grapes. The next day, I got to work on our new gardens, which I placed right next to our animal farms. I wasn't sure what to plant inside of them yet, but I definitely wanted to plant the crops that we found while exploring. This is when I noticed that the sugarcane farm looked kind of odd without the cobble border that we had for the other garden plots, so I started placing some to match the theme of the base. Day 91, I decided to work on our new gardens instead. In the first garden, we were going to plant corn, and once we tilled all the soil, I had to figure out how to get more corn kernels. It turns out that if you throw normal wheat seeds at a stone cutter, it'll turn into corn kernels. So we had corn this whole entire time. I gathered a bunch of those seeds and started to plant them in our new garden. After that was finished, we worked on the other farm. This one, we were going to plant hops. The work on the hops garden continued on to the next day as we finished tilling the soil and planting our seeds. Following this, I tended to the bee farm and reworked the sugarcane fields. You see, they had a bit of an ugly shape to them, so I decided to tear it down completely, got rid of all the sugarcane, and started with a new garden plot. This took us a while as I had to get the correct shape before planting our sugarcane. I finished the first sugarcane field, filling it up with water and covering the source blocks with dirt slabs. Now, the garden looks way better with the cobblestone border around it. We just had to do the same thing to the other side and mirror the same shape. At around noon, the second sugarcane field was complete. Looking at the base from above, our home was starting to come along very nicely. Our hops even finished growing and I harvested them. Despite this, we had one big problem. I don't know how to get more of the hop seeds. You just can't place it in the crafting menu and turn them into seeds, and throwing them in a stone cutter doesn't do anything. I looked up some guides, but it seems like you could only get them by trading or finding them in the wild. Whatever it was, I just decided to go through with it and brew ourselves our first mug of beer. To do this, we had to make a brewing station, which we placed in our warehouse. After that, you have to power it up with fuel and mix it with water. To brew beer, it was kind of like a mini game where you had to pay attention to the water levels. After some time, we brewed ourselves our very first batch of delicious hops beer, scooping it up with some finely crafted wooden mugs. I was about to head home when I heard the sound of a skeleton outside. When I arrived, the skeleton had just died, and next to it, a wild dog. This wild dog, who we've never met, protected and guarded our garden. So, with the 2 bones that the skeleton dropped, I managed to tame this friend of ours. What should we name him? The next day came, and I got to harvesting our corn stalks. With the corn that we collected, I tossed them into the silos, and after a few seconds, they turned into bags of dried corn. This we could turn into more beer, but I decided to lay off of it for a while since I have yet to try our first mug. Drinking the hops beer gives us a couple of effects which lasted for quite some time. It was nice to see the product of our hard work. Since our hops field was fairly empty, I decided to plant the crops that we found on our adventure, hoping to add some color to our fields. After that, I harvested the jungle grapes and made some more wine. It was then that I was able to taste the new wine that we made, which gave us double jump. It's pretty cool, to be honest, but not very useful. To end the night, I made more pasta. We crafted a cutting board and knife and grounded up some beef. Combining the patties, pasta, and leftover tomato sauce, we cooked pasta and meatballs. Day 96, we got up early to feed the bees. Then I forgot that I had potatoes, so I grabbed them out of the chest to plant in our garden. After that, I went around adding more paths to connect places together and finished the day by filling in the dirt that was exposed from the path blocks. Day 97, I finished up the last bits of detailing and then harvested the jungle grapes growing at the side of our house. Now that we were close to the finish line, I was unsure of what to build or add to this world. It felt like to me we did almost everything already. There were a couple of projects that I thought about, but they were too big and would take more days to finish. This is when I decided that I wanted to build silos to store crops as they would fit well with the theme of our farm. So, with my pickaxe in hand, I headed down into the mines to dig up cobblestone. I got on my horse and set off far into the horizon, back to the lands that we explored earlier, as I remembered there were a lot of granite and mud that I could use to build these silos. I wanted the silos to have a reddish-brown color so these blocks would fit well. I had to cross 2 rivers and swim on my horse to reach the barren area, and then got started digging up stacks of granite. Day 99, we had one more day left in the 100-day challenge. Now that we had enough granite that we collected yesterday, we just had to get enough mud and then head on back home. By the time I arrived home, it was starting to get dark, so with some polished granite and mud bricks, I began building the foundation of the first silo. This silo would be located next to our warehouse, and as the sun set, we slept on top of this building. Day 100, the last and almost final day of this video. Because building these 2 silos was taking more time than expected, I didn't mind taking a few more days to build what I wanted. We finished the first silo, sealing the top with a stone roof, and then started on creating the second one next to our winery. The construction would last up until day 101, as we made some minor mistakes along the way and had to correct them to make the silo look more balanced. After that, I filled up the floor with coarse dirt and then started making more paths to connect the silos. Day 102, I finished up the paths to our silos and took a step back to enjoy everything that we built. From our first house to the little gardens filled with crops, our grapevines and animal farms, as well as our brewery and winery. Heck, even the bee farm in which bees would go missing. I even made 2 new friends along the way. This was 100 days in CozyHaven, and if you guys want to see another video where I survive another 100 days, let me know in the comments below. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys next time.